Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the extraction of the Venezuelan leader, former Nicolas Maduro. We'll discuss Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, stepping out of the ring, and our own Geoff Shullenberger's run-in with the authorities in El Salvador. I'm joined by Geoff Shullenberger and by Ashley Frawley, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, we've seen the memes. Nicolas Maduro is out of Venezuela. Trump ran against forever wars. He's saying that we may need to be in Venezuela for some time. We're also told this isn't a war because really it was just the removal of a single man. And Trump, interestingly, does seem ready to work with Maduro's own lieutenant. So the regime, I don't know, is the regime changing? They've removed the leader, but is this regime change, Geoff?
I would say no, it's not regime change. And this is, in a way, what I would praise about this operation. So I'll say two positive things about it in order to then set up, what I see as maybe the problems going forward. And obviously
more than two negative things.
Well, I think the negative things I'll point out will be in a way the flip side of the positive things. So obviously this operation was highly successful in a limited sense. You've seen a lot of euphoria about that. A lot of people just kind of celebrating it, and clearly, as an operation, it was highly successful. There have been some speculations that the success may be owed in part to defector, or not defector, but let's say elements of the regime that were disloyal to Maduro, and wanted to sort of sacrifice him in order to set the ground for a reset with the U.S. So that's one possibility. It's being debated whether this is true, but there's some. I mean, I've seen some Venezuela experts on the left, including Eva Gollinger, the lawyer, who was very close to the Chavez regime way back when, and is quite knowledgeable, although obviously also kind of tendentious, and is not, even though she was sympathetic to the Chavez regime, is not, an apologist for the current Venezuelan government. But she has argued that there's good evidence that Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president who's now been elevated to the presidency, and her brother, who are important figures in the regime, again, essentially sacrificed Maduro in order to advance their own interests, and also, again, possibly reset relations with the U.S. on different terms. So in any case, the first positive thing I'll say is that operationally it was obviously a success. It's funny, I've just been reading this book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, which is all about the Delta Force and other kind of special operations units, and how screwed up they are, and how corrupt and caught up in the drug trade and various other things they have become during the period of the War on Terror. But obviously, despite, and there are many stories that could be told about ways that they've kind of broken bad and gone awry in recent years, but nonetheless, clearly can be an incredibly capable force, as we also saw with the apprehension of bin Laden, although or the killing of bin Laden. Although obviously in that case too, there was speculation that essentially it was something of a setup, in the sense that the Pakistani intelligence, gave the location and essentially collaborated with the capture. So I think that's probably something that can be compared to the killing of bin Laden in terms of just sheer operational cleanness and success. And I think it should be contrasted to the completely disastrous operation against Gaddafi, which led to this, horrible, just kind of brutal mob murder of Gaddafi, and subsequently led to essentially a failed state and sort of regime collapse situation. Which brings me to my second positive point, which is that it does seem that even though I think there are many lessons of history that this administration and its supporters are showing they have not learned, it does seem that they learned the negative lessons of several recent regime change operations, including that in Libya, which I mentioned, and obviously Iraq, where there was this process of de-Baathification, which essentially laid the groundwork for the anti-occupation insurgency and various developments, including the rise of ISIS in subsequent years. And so that they seem to have realized that there's a real danger in just kind of destroying a military and governing apparatus at one fell swoop, and just kind of casting it out into the wilderness, because that is going to be the basis of when you have organized and knowledgeable people who you just kind of cast out into the wilderness, they're very likely to spearhead insurgencies and make things very difficult. So it does seem that there's an attempt to develop a modus vivendi with what remains of the regime, which is pretty much the whole thing, other than the president himself. So at this point, it's too soon to tell. I think there's a lot of contradictory messaging coming out, but this would sort of lead me to, I said two things: one, operational success; two, regime permanence or regime continuity. That these are both, I think, things to be positively impressed by about this operation, but they leave a huge number of questions open. The first one being, there's obviously always the question of what's the day after scenario, what's going to happen next. And I think, plenty of people are sort of saying, aha, see, you could have just done this in Iraq. Why do we have to do this whole kind of wasteful occupation process? Well, I mean, that's not even really a remotely meaningful analysis, because the whole reason that they did that is because the whole reason that they occupied Iraq, set up the provisional authority, and so on, is because they actually had a plan as to what things were going to look like the next day. And it seems to me pretty clear that for the moment, the administration just kind of wants to bask in the aura of the success of this operation, but doesn't really have a very clear plan of what things are going to look like going forward. And, it's I think that there's obviously plenty to criticize about how it turned out in Iraq, but I think you can argue that this is really another sign of weakness and sort of fecklessness from this administration, that they don't really have a very clear plan. I would guess that what's going on now is some kind of compromise between different factions. On one hand, you have the people who have long wanted to simply depose the Venezuelan regime and put in power somebody like the Nobel Prize winner Maria Corina Machado, and sort of restore democracy to Venezuela. And then on the which is essentially the kind of neocon vision, which would have been closer to the Iraq project. And then on the other hand, you have people like Richard Grenell, who was the special envoy there, who seemed to take a much more brutally pragmatic approach, which does seem to be the one that's most consistent with Trump's own instincts, that he doesn't mind working with, sort of thuggish regimes that are happy to cut deals with him. And so I suppose the question now is whether this regime is willing and also, frankly, able to cut a deal with the administration that it's happy with. And so, I think, again, the two positives, operational success and regime permanence, also raise just a lot of questions because we don't really know what any of this is going to look like going forward. And as far as this whole idea of just taking the oil, which is, Trump's consistent critique of the Iraq invasion, I think there's a sense in which that's just as much a fantasy as the fantasies of bringing, peace and democracy to Iraq were, because you have to actually achieve that. And the only way you're going to achieve that is through a very large and effective military occupation. And that brings with it costs that, and so I think the idea that Trump's sort of crude and transactional approach is in contrast with that of the Bush administration is something of a fallacy. Because the fact is, the Bush administration understood that you had to have a long-term effective military occupation in order to achieve strategic goals. Then they attempted to accord legitimacy to that operation by, using this whole sort of ideology of democracy. But, if you just try to do the whole long-term military occupation without any ideological legitimation whatsoever and just say, yes, we're here to plunder your resources and take them for ourselves to enrich ourselves. I think that, again, I said there are many lessons of history that we could learn here, but it's just clear that is not a reasonable long-term plan. And again, is just as much a fantasy as, the rise of a glorious, prosperous democracy in Iraq was. I mean, in some ways, a more pernicious fantasy, I would say, because it's at least the neocon fantasy understood, and this I've been thinking about Francis Fukuyama, who I mentioned as my top read of 2025, but understood that there was a need to secure legitimacy and to make people feel that they are being accorded some sort of recognition as democratic subjects. So the idea that you can just kind of go in and bully people around and nakedly plunder them forever. And if you look at the sort of dissident right posters on X, who are sort of the seething id of the Trump regime, in terms of like who are the people who they follow and kind of get their propaganda cues from, just completely delusional nonsense. I mean, this guy Matt Forney basically said something along the lines of, "The world is going to be our slaves." I mean, this is far more delusional than anything the neocons said. It's just completely fantastical and nonsensical. So,
it's also a kind of hilarious vindication of, St. Augustine's writing on empire, which he presents as, this kind of moral temptation that, which obviously the powerful dominates the strong, but also the powerful is kind of dominated by his own kind of baseness, his own, he is himself enslaved to his kind of libido, his desire to dominate. So yeah, it's pretty wild. Ashley, what do people outside the glorious shores of Colombia, our home, America, this blessed land, make of this?
Actually, just from a normie perspective, someone sent me a meme that, which I'm sure you probably saw, was ICE accidentally deports Maduro, which was kind of funny. Anyway, well, you were talking about how there's like sort of like naked plunder or whatever, but is there not a thin veneer of an attempt at legitimacy in terms of classifying this as law enforcement as opposed to invasion? So once you kind of frame a state as criminal, a government as criminal, not a state, a government, then, you don't really have to respect sovereignty. The leaders are extraditable, and it's framed really in an odd way as technical, as rather than a sort of geopolitical thing, right? So there is at least that kind of like attempt to put this sort of thin veneer of legitimacy over it. But I think another way of another thing that I've been seeing people put forward as an understanding, which is interesting in that it's not as much a powerful frame as one would expect, perhaps because I'm on Twitter and those forces may have been liquidated from Twitter. But this idea of like Venezuela being punished for resisting capitalism, so this frame of like, oh, actually, this is, capitalism versus socialism. And I think, I haven't seen that frame accepted by the right or the left as much as one would think. But of course, this would simply confuse people because Venezuela obviously isn't being attacked because it's socialist. It's attacked because the form through which there has been an attempt to integrate it into capitalism hasn't been working. And so when that happens, you have an assertion of discipline on the global front. So capitalism can tolerate a certain amount of inefficiency, but if you're sitting on all these resources and you're not using them to accumulate, to contribute to global capital accumulation, there will be an assertion of force and discipline. And this reclassifying the government as a criminal entity allows for that assertion of discipline. And that's a very old thing. That's not something that's unique to the Trump administration by any means. But what I think is really interesting is, and I think you mentioned, Geoff, you mentioned this as well, is this idea of not having any kind of plan for afterward. And I think this actually fits into the way that Venezuela has functioned or failed to function in terms of contributing to global capitalism. So rather than trying to integrate it into capitalism, you have this kind of disengagement with it as a state, this abandonment with it as a state in the sense that there's no commitment to rebuilding society. And so, there's no plan for reconstruction. There's no promise of integration, no promise of development or political normalization or anything like that. It's because Venezuela is being perceived or portrayed as a kind of failed interface. There's no society there to be rebuilt. And we see this not just, I wrote about this in my piece, A World Without People, in a kind of roundabout way, in the sense that capitalism is losing that rebuilding kind of force populations are now seen as surplus, politics are seen as disposable, whole countries can be disposable. You don't even have to promise that capitalism will create a world market that raises all boats, this rising tide that eventually raises all boats. Like, yes, okay, we have global inequality, but look, we've raised people out of poverty and so on. We don't have to promise that anymore. You can just go in and take out a leader and extract its resources, treat that population as surplus, and move on. And so this is, we have capitalism without incorporation. And that is a bit different than the promise of past imperialism, which promised kind of administration and order and productive populations and stability of long-term governance. But the US doesn't want to do that. It wants oil flows. It wants control over assets, maybe some risk management. But there isn't a kind of commitment to social reproduction, and not even a lie about it. And I think that's really interesting. I think it speaks to a kind of, I'm trying to say this in a very simple way, because this is one of these sort of projects that I've been working on for some time that is so complicated that I'm finding it difficult to see it through to fruition. But this kind of negative abolition of capitalism, where capitalism starts to abolish itself, but without any kind of serious push against it, any kind of powerful opposing force that is future oriented, you wind up producing all sorts of destruction without creation, without the other side of creation. And so you just have naked use of law and so on, and naked extraction of resources without anything that is produced in return or promised or anything like that. And I think this is partially because of this kind of desperation of capitalism and the need to extract as much as possible, and the failure of social reproduction within that there's just no point. Why bother with these people, these states, and so on? That all that matters is global flows. If that makes sense. That's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting point here is that Venezuela's oil infrastructure is highly degraded, and so its oil output is very reduced from where it was, and much lower than it could be. And that
can't have that.
relates to all kinds of things, right? It relates to all kinds of things, including the policies of the government, but also the sanctions. And I suppose the interesting thing here is that there's been some debate about, you have sort of people in the administration all the way up to Trump sort of saying, yes, we've talked about this before, of this sort of ethos of yes, blood for oil or whatever. But the interesting thing is that the call for this does not seem to be coming at all from the oil companies, which in some ways would have been happier to have the sanction. I've read some things to the effect that most of them were actually lobbying to have the sanctions removed. Now, there are sort of conflicting interests within the oil industry, some of which are actually happy with the sanctions, because reductions of supply from some areas will benefit some actors. But the point is, the industry was not at all kind of aligned behind this operation. In some ways, the problem is going to be to get the industry to make the capital investments necessary to revitalize Venezuelan oil output, which currently is dwindling. And so, but it doesn't seem that the sort of big oil companies are desperate to undertake this. So I guess the interesting thing is that, it's not even clear to me that you have on the part of direct capitalist interests, you necessarily have the incentive to do the things that these political actors, Trump and so on, want them to do. And it's very interesting, like the history of nationalization of oil in Venezuela. It goes back a very long way, it's almost 100 years. And the various kinds of the various phases of nationalization. But the point is, there was kind of a long political process involved in this, and at different points, the oil companies kind of had to, find ways to coexist with different sets of political arrangements. And at the moment, it seems as if, partly because the politics became so disastrous, much of the oil industry just kind of didn't want to, didn't think it was worth its efforts or expenditures to even be involved. So, an interesting problem is, like, can you have that extraction without social reproduction? I think, you can sort of set up these, I suppose the model here would be some sort of, special economic zone dedicated to oil, where you just have mercenary forces guarding installations, and it's completely separate from society. And you just have the oil flows secured by processes that kind of circumvent politics altogether. So that's probably something like the model. You sort of have you basically just have these oil installations that are guarded by Blackwater, and you can just kind of circumvent politics that way. But whether that actually works, or is just another kind of fantasy, is maybe less clear to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems more like a Blackwater kind of thing as opposed to sort of individual capitalists. Individual capitalists don't want things like this, because you wind up with all sorts of risk and instability, reputational issues. They don't want to deal with any of that stuff. And also, they're not like particularly interested. They want money at the end of the day. They don't necessarily care that much about actually producing a product. So if they're able to extract enough, then they're fine. But in the terms of like a global, from a perspective like global capital accumulation, you can't have a country that's sitting on resources like that and not effectively integrating them into the global system. So you need, firms themselves will pull back, and then this, state level, large scale, more sort of larger scale forces will step in. to resolve these kinds of issues, to integrate, to extract more quickly, more effectively, to accumulate.
It seems that the geostrategic frame is more helpful in explaining this action than the economic frame. In terms of is this the logic of capitalism? It seems more like the logic of great power politics to kind of simply to secure Venezuela and its vast energy resources within the American orbit rather than the Chinese orbit. I think that's a more helpful frame, but where I myself am, I guess, a bit perplexed is that it's not entirely clear to me what exactly the Trump administration stance toward China is. So certainly, if one were preparing for a confrontation with China, a move like this would make a great deal of sense. But the second Trump administration has been notably more dovish on China in the economic sphere than either the first Trump administration or especially than the Biden administration, which actually kind of intensified the China hawkishness that Trump 1 introduced. So, those are questions that we'll be kind of exploring more in the pages of Compact. Is there some kind of underlying logic to this seeming kind of geopolitical gamesmanship along with a kind of economic thawing? Or is it simply a matter of the contradictions of the Trump coalition working themselves out?
That's actually a really important point towards what I was saying, is that Trump is stepping in where capital won't. And they even say it explicitly. Like, what's the point of having this great power if we don't use it? Let's go back to the time of great powers of states, asserting their power on the global stage. Yeah, because capitalists won't do that. They don't want to do that. They're risk averse. They don't care, and Trump is the one who's stepping in to do that. So I do think that that power actually has a really important role in that, of sort of overcoming this sluggishness of capital.
Regime change in Minnesota, the land of 1,000 lakes. Not exactly, but Tim Walz, the governor, announced that he won't be running for re-election. He cited in his announcement the controversy over childcare centers in Minnesota that, according to various sources, have been defrauding Minnesota taxpayers by claiming to serve more children than they actually do. Many of these childcare centers that have been discussed in the controversy are run by members of the Somali immigrant community in Minnesota, which is closely tied to Walz's Democratic Party. And Walz is stepping aside. I guess he's taking one for the team. It's a pretty stunning fall, though. I mean, this man was close to being a heartbeat away from the presidency. And now he's not even seen as having enough juice to win re-election in a state where Democrats have won every statewide office since 2006. It's a very democratic state. And evidently, his party doesn't think he'll necessarily be able to win. So he had to step aside. Geoff, can you give us an elegy for our fallen king, Tim Walz?
Yeah. So his
one of the boys with his camo hats,
remarkable
and his
rise.
IH scout.
Exactly.
The truth.
His remarkable rise last year, I suppose, was obviously an attempt to find an acceptable representative of the white rural constituencies that had fallen away from the Democratic Party, and it did represent this kind of aesthetic attempt to emulate a kind of MAGA look, including these Harris Walz camo hats that I still maybe occasionally have seen. I mean, maybe not in the colder weather, but I think, well after the election, I still was seeing them around Brooklyn. But yeah, I think I suppose it's ironic that this representative of rural America, was kind of felled by this classic sort of urban graft scandal. This sort of, it feels almost like something you would have heard about in the old days of machine politics, just these kind of ethnic enclaves figuring out, and this stuff never went away. It's always been around in different forms, but these ethnic enclaves figuring out ways to kind of juice the system to extract some flows of state money towards and sort of direct them towards their communities, and then rewarding the political party that facilitated this. It's very old kind of urban machine style politics. It seems to me, I don't know Minnesota politics well. I believe we're going to have Daryl Paul writing on this, who is a Minnesotan, so he will inform me better. My understanding of perhaps why this was so fatal is that, part of the selling point of Minnesota politics was it was, the closest thing to kind of Scandinavian progressive sort of good governance in North America, because of of course, Scandinavian heritage of many people in the state. It's other, beyond the Somali community and a few other enclaves, it's a relatively white state, especially for a Democratic dominated one. But and so it has a little bit of that kind of Nordic socialist flavor, but the image of this sort of rank corruption obviously kind of clashes with that, and so you can sort of see why it doesn't, why it's not an easy scandal to overcome. I think, and we published Herman Diaz del Castillo today on a kind of Mexican parallel, a story involving the former left-wing president Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who, basically as part of what he calls Republican austerity, chose to shut down a state-run or a state-funded childcare program. And I think what's specifically interesting about that is that former President AMLO, basically chose to cut out the middleman and instead direct payments for childcare directly to families. So part of why this seems significant is that a great deal, this kind of corruption, but just a great deal of corruption that exists, I'd say, particularly in blue states, and I've had a few sort of encounters with this kind of thing myself, really has to do with this intermediation of public services, where you have these vast kind of blobs of NGOs and other sorts of, sort of subtly public services. And this seems to be, just to give you one example, I had a friend who was a while ago doing social work, go do an MSW, Master's in Social Work, and was placed in a Brooklyn public school as sort of in the school counseling office. And this was, it's one of these things where, actually the school counselors are not employed directly by the state or by the school. There's some separate subcontracted service that, then provides, these counseling services. And, he essentially had to become a whistleblower because the corruption that he witnessed in that context was spectacular. Basically, the other counselor, sort of long-term he was just an intern essentially doing a kind of on the, job training as part of his degree. But, the other counselors who were, ostensibly long-term, they're basically just like didn't show up to work and were collecting salaries for literally doing nothing. And so, this is just the kind of thing that is rampant in a lot of blue states and cities, in part because you have this intermediation of services. Another context where I've encountered it is dealing with the Medicaid bureaucracy on behalf of a relative, that there are huge, and this is something Republicans were saying about Medicaid, but there are huge amounts of corruption, but that really have to do with this model of outsourcing and subcontracting everything to these intermediary organizations. So to me, that's, I mean, beyond the kind of interesting aspect of like old school machine politics corruption that, I think does put a dent in the sort of good governance image of Minnesota Democrats. Quite a serious dent. I would say the bigger story here, and I think obviously the Republicans have made it about immigration. To me, the bigger story really has to do with this reliance on intermediaries and the kinds of corruption that engenders. And I do think our piece about the Mexican, left-wing government that essentially cut out the middlemen and created a new system in which childcare funding went directly to families to do what they chose to, is a good illustration of how you can pursue similar sort of progressive goals while at the same time cutting out these corrupting intermediary organizations.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, that's and it's ironic too, because a lot of the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration and things like DOGE were the long-term policy outlooks that created this situation. That is, you hollow out the state. The state no longer does anything. Increasingly, the state doesn't do what you want a state to do. Becomes an administrative state, becomes a state that simply oversees and creates checklists and so on. And so you give the money to these NGOs who have this veneer of charity and closeness to the people on the ground. And the state simply provides these checklists that the NGOs fill out and say, yes, I've done a wonderful job. Thank you for the money. And so the state winds up holding all the risk, actually. And part of the reason why they hollow this out is to they sort of offload some of the risk onto these NGOs. But in terms of like whether or not children actually get fed, or there's childcare, or there's like outcomes like women going into work, the state is holding all of that risk because they have that expectation on them. But they're giving money to these NGOs to actually carry that out. And this is the failure of the regulatory state, the failure of the administrative state, which we've seen in so many different occasions, particularly during COVID, is that you had all these, the state increasingly just creates all these plans, and then the NGOs and civil society organizations are supposed to execute the plans, but they're constantly rolling over and churning and doing all sorts of different things. They're very difficult to track, and they're often responsible simply for filling out checklists, and they then often do what they want. And it is rampant. It's not just in the US. It is all over the place. I just did a whole bunch of research for MCC Brussels on this, where I chased down all this money, tons and tons of money going into these LGBTIQ groups and so on. And I looked at their educational materials. I signed up for the courses, played the games, the gamification platforms. And the thing that struck me most, how much money was going into it, how crappy it was. There's the really poor quality of a lot of this stuff. People were they were taking millions, in their organizations and giving people jobs and promotions. And for what? I don't know. Sitting there creating, a super fun platform game to teach young LGBTIQ youth self-respect. And it's like the game was like a wall of text, and then answer multiple choice questions. Like, really, I'm not even joking. Like, someone literally just copied and pasted their propaganda into this game site. And this is, they're getting millions for this junk. And the trouble is too, and I think the tide is turning now, obviously, but a lot of this went on and is going on and has been going on for so long because of a shield of good intentions. We saw this with Black Lives Matter, right? Like, you give a ton of money to these organizations because they are going to right a social wrong. And if you question that, you looked horrible, and if you question what a lot of these NGOs were doing, if you question the NGO complex generally, you looked like a horrible person. And so it just went on with this kind of rampant wastage and essentially corruption because of this shield of good intentions. And the other thing too is that NGOs are being used to this day to evade subsidiarity. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with the principle of subsidiarity. So you want to have decisions made by the lowest kind of person, the person closest to the phenomenon. When it comes to the EU, that means that member states need to be able to make decisions on things that the the EU doesn't have control over, things like education. That there are certain things that are, within member state priorities or competence. And in the US, there's similar kind of principles at play. But there are larger agendas, particularly around values, that changing people's values, educating populations toward becoming citizens with who are more amenable to governance and so on, that require evasion of subsidiarity. And NGOs are often very well placed to do this. So in education, for example, they will fund NGOs to create BS educational materials that are then laundered as good practice and sent all over the country. And now you have essentially a national education program, but for some objective that the state wants, and creates all of these pays NGOs to create these educational materials that then pop up all over the country. You can see this with all sorts of faddish crap like self-esteem and whatever it might be. You get all of a sudden all the kids in every school are learning about self-esteem or how to manage their mental health or whatever it might be. So Walz has taken the fall on this, but it is not an isolated problem that can be reduced to a single man. It is a massive problem that the Trump administration itself is feeding by hollowing out the state and turning it into, and by continuing the long-term hollowing out of the state and its transformation into an administrative organ that simply administrates all these NGOs. Administers, I should say.
It's a huge issue. I mentioned earlier, Mamdani, who's so I mentioned on an earlier podcast, Mamdani, who's celebrated or decried as this kind of big government socialist, and probably the signature element of this in terms of his campaign proposals is his idea to have city-owned grocery stores. Well, where these ideas have been implemented or proposed by other progressive urban governments, they've generally been administered by third parties. And so this is kind of the pattern of the progressive machine today. And as you say, Ashley, it's a pattern. There's a kind of dynamic where, the right slashes governments, and then, the left, rather than sort of expanding government itself, kind of expands kind of handouts to NGOs, which end up performing these governmental functions, but less accountably and often less efficiently. In terms of, Walz's political obituary, which has still to be written, pay attention to Compact. We'll have more on him soon. I think this kind of shows the folly of viewing him as a potential reincarnation of a kind of Midwest progressivism, that was expressed in different ways in kind of prairie populism. You had things, the earlier in the 20th century where, North Dakota had a state-owned coal mine. North Dakota and South Dakota had state-owned, grain elevators, right? My home state of Nebraska to this day has all public power, the only state in the union to have it, with not a single private kilowatt hour sold in the state since the 1940s. And then along with that kind of prairie populism, you have the sewer socialism of the upper Midwest associated with areas with heavy German, especially, and also Scandinavian immigration. So when Walz emerged on the national scene, I think some people looked to him and thought, he can maybe revive this tradition, because that's one of the most functional examples we have of kind of workable progressive economic vision within America. Well, something very different has been going on in Minnesota. It's not state-owned and operated provision of public goods, obviously. Instead, you have this kind of weird NGO system interacting in seemingly perverse ways with issues of immigration and diversity, which of course we've long dealt with in America. So I think that's kind of the deeper disappointment of Tim Walz, and that was kind of the highbrow version of what some people hoped Tim Walz could deliver to the Democratic coalition. At the level of pure vibes, it was sort of the camo hat, the IH Scout, the Remington Wingmaster shotgun or whatever he had. He probably had an Italian gun, something nicer. But in the highbrow sense, he was supposed to kind of bring a little prairie populism, sewer socialism into the coalition. That never happened. Now we need to turn to the most important headline of all. Geoff, I understand that you have had a run-in with the authorities in El Salvador. You may be at risk of being sent to CCOT because of your disrespectful takes on El Salvador's criminal justice revolution. Can you explain your crimes?
Yeah, I mean, I've wanted to go back there, but now I'm not sure if it's a wise idea. My crime was tweeting actually back in October just a chart that showed that a considerable amount of the reduction of crime in El Salvador actually occurred before Nayib Bukele was president. And the reason I pointed this out is just to say that I think there are a lot of people. I mean, I was not even so much critiquing the government of El Salvador as critiquing the sort of one weird trick interpretation of what's happened there that's very popular on the American right, because it's actually been a much longer, more complicated process. The reduction of crime there that proceeded in various stages and involved various different approaches and strategies. So anyway, I mean, I thought it was a pretty mild sort of attempt to nuance the story of what's happened there and go beyond the sort of Bukele superhero image that you often get, where he just kind of comes in, he's the new sheriff in town, locks up all the bad guys, and everything's great. So anyway, the only reason this is significant, it wasn't even a particularly viral or notable tweet, but President Bukele himself retweeted it and sort of attempted to refute what I said. I don't personally think what he said is necessarily at odds with what I said. But, he called me an armchair pundit, which, I mean, I did actually.
Is that a misdemeanor or a felony in Bukele's El Salvador?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's a state of exception, so anything goes, whatever he decides. But yeah, it was an interesting reminder of, I suppose it brought me back to, when people were first using Twitter back in, I didn't join it until like 2013, 2014, but I remember people talking about, oh, you can like tweet at some, celebrity or politician and they'll actually reply to you. And obviously this has sort of been, a continued theme in some ways, but it reminded me I can actually get the attention of a leader of a sovereign nation. And then, so I chose to reply by sending him the article I had written based on the reporting I did there back in 2024. And who knows whether he read it. I did request an interview with him at the time, and I assume he was too busy barnstorming, but it would be interesting. I think he's one thing I do say in that article is that whatever else you may say about him, he's a very skilled PR man, which was his profession before going into politics. And I don't think I can see why my version of the story, which is sort of nuanced and complicated and multifaceted, isn't it's not the version of the story he wants to tell. But it was interesting to see him reply to it because it was not by any means the most vociferous criticism of him or his government that you'll find. So in any case, it was an interesting experience to have that picked up that way.
It's a great article, Geoff. The title is
Bukele's Kingdom of Dreams.
And as you say, it's great because it complicates the narrative that you've kind of heard of from the kind of online right about Bukele, but it's not some kind of denunciation of him. And it's a piece of journalism I'm very proud of as the editor of Compact, because I think it expresses what we seek to deliver to our readers, which is something they really don't get elsewhere in terms of looking at these big stories and complex issues in a way that's subtle, sophisticated, but willing to draw surprising conclusions. So that's my pitch for subscribing to Compact at compactmag.com/subscribe. A lot of people are joining. Subscriptions are way up. So go with the crowd. Do it. And with that, thank you, Ashley. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato. And thank you, listeners.